Okay, well, let's make a start for another week at the CSAE webinar. Thanks everyone for joining us. We're really thrilled this week to welcome Lisa Spantig, who's at the Economics Department at the University of Essex. She's here today to present her paper on flexible microcredit. We're fortunate not just to have her, but also her two co-authors, Christina Zura and Annette John. I think everyone here probably knows the house rules by now, but you see them on the screen. We're starting right about now, and Lisa will present for about 40-45 minutes. And then from then to the top of the hour, we'll take some open questions. Of course, we'd love to have questions and discussion throughout. So if you have questions, then please use the Q&A function or raise your hand, and then we'll throw to Lisa whenever the opportunity presents. Lisa, thank you very much for joining us. I look forward to hearing the presentation.
Thank you very much, Simon, for this kind introduction. Thank you all for joining me here. So this is going to be about flexible microcredit and what effects we see on both loan repayment and social pressure. And let me jump right in. Why do we care about microcredit? Well, it's one of the ways where to provide access to finance for the poor. And from the lender's perspective, it has worked very well in the sense that repayment rates are very high, and there are two key features that are attributed to this. The first one are same size, regular, high frequency loan repayment installments. So basically think about repaying £5 each week, and this is thought to create this repayment morale or the routine in the sense of habit formation. The second feature that has been attributed to these high repayment rates is joint liability group lending. So basically think about a group of borrowers all receive their own loan, but they're jointly liable for the repayment of each loan. This can be beneficial because it provides some mutual insurance, because if I, in the group with Annette and Christina, I'm not able to repay today, they will help me repay, so creating this mutual insurance. It's also helpful in terms of repayment enforcement because Christina will know way better how I'm actually doing as compared to the microfinance organization. So that looks all very nice, but more recently, both of these features have actually been criticized. So the rigid repayment schedules are incompatible with fluctuating incomes, right? So if you always need to repay £5 and you face a substantial variation in how much you actually earn, that can result in over-indebtedness and or underinvestment. And the joint liability feature of microcredit can induce excessive peer pressure in the sense that people would even punish their peers if the shocks are fully observable and are not caused by the borrower themselves. So the by now famous AJ applied issue kind of also documents a limited effect on poverty reduction, pointing towards some positive heterogeneity, but overall calls for more flexible, targeted product design. So what is repayment flexibility and how does it benefit the borrower? So flexible repayment schedules might facilitate high-risk, high-return investments because they don't require this every week repayment that these rigid contracts require. However, so that kind of sounds very nice for the borrower, but if we look into practice, there are very few of these flexible repayment schedules offered. And this is due to practitioners usually worrying that once we take away this rigidity, then also this repayment discipline breaks down. And if we look into default rates, so not repaying these flexible loans, there's actually mixed empirical evidence, both pointing towards higher default and lower default with flexible credit products. And generally, these effects are explained with the project choice. So people invest into these more risky projects, which can turn out well, then we will see low default, or can turn out badly, and then we will see high default. However, if we look more closely towards the argument that the practitioners are making, it becomes evident that they're not so much focused on how people actually invest their loans, so what we call ante-moral hazard, but they're rather worrying about ex post moral hazard, so basically not repaying if you could. And we know that ex post moral hazard plays an important role in rigid repayment contracts, and we will actually look at how ex post moral hazard is affected by repayment flexibility. A second feature that we will be looking at addressing this other component, the excessive peer pressure, is how repayment flexibility affects the lending or the group dynamics in these lending groups. So this is the slide that kind of summarizes the study in a nutshell. So the main question we are after is, how do the flexible loan contracts affect this choice not to repay, ex post moral hazard, and social pressure? And we will be comparing rigid and flexible repayment schedules, where in our case, flexibility allows to defer one repayment installment to the next period. And how do we do this? Well, we set up a lab in the field experiment with 645 microcredit clients in the Philippines, and we play a microcredit lending game where we can focus on individual repayment decisions. Importantly, we will exogenously vary both the availability of flexibility and also the possibility to punish and exert social pressure by changing the liability structure. So either people face individual or joint liability. And findings, we see a benefit and the cost of flexibility in the sense that flexibility increases the choice not to repay, so the strategic default, but it lowers social pressure. Now, how can we explain this? And this is the second part of the paper, where we basically argue that repayment choices are driven by social norms. So we have a theoretical framework, and the one sentence intuition of this is that flexibility decreases repayment because the norm that applies to repayment is based on these flexible repayment installments. And once flexibility is introduced, this norm becomes less applicable, and it's uncertain how to actually conform to this norm. And then what we do is we kind of reanalyze our experimental data with respect to the theoretical predictions, and then finally go back to the field to measure social norms in a similar sample. Okay, let me briefly take a step back and tell you why we are looking at a lab and a field experiment here, given that most of you are maybe more familiar with field experiment. So we're kind of trying to capture the benefits of both the lab and the field, in the sense that we will be able to identify this ex post moral hazard, so the decision to repay if you're actually able to, by making idiosyncratic income shocks fully observable. And this will allow us to disentangle the choice to repay from the capacity to repay. The second nice feature of more control in a lab style environment is that we will be able to quantify excessive social pressure. And here we will borrow from the experimental lab literature using costly punishment. So these two features, you wonder, okay, why do we go into the field, given that this is also implementable in the lab? Well, the last feature of this lab and the field experiment is that we will be building on the experience and the social capital of the participants in our experiment. So what we will be doing is we will conduct the experiments in places that borrowers usually meet and repay their loans, and we will use a lot of microcredit framing and words that are related to the lending process to kind of make it realistic for our participants. There's three ways how we contribute to the literature. First, the literature on flexible microcredit and how it actually affects repayment rates. So here we will be showing a causal effect of repayment flexibility on the decision not to repay, ex post moral hazard. We will also relate to the SLAT literature on punishment, in particular Christina's study, where she has shown that borrowers actually punish each other quite a bit, even if income shocks are observable. And we will look at how this peer pressure interacts with the contract structure. Lastly, and this is more loosely related, we also refer to this literature on the importance of social norms. that has recently emerged that discussing how social norms determine a variety of behaviors. And here we kind of suggest that norms help explain these very high repayment rates that we see in microcredit. Okay, maybe if there are any questions, I would pause here before I go and explain experimental.
None at the moment, so we can go on. Thanks.
Okay, perfect. So let me first give you an overview, and then I will describe in detail all the 4 treatments that we're implementing. So we will have a microcredit repayment game, which I will describe on the next slide, where we will look at individual repayment decisions, and we can introduce idiosyncratic shocks on repayment capacity. And we will vary 2 things. On the one hand, the repayment structure, either there's flexibility or there is none, and the liability structure, either looking at joint liability or individual liability. And importantly, and this will be important in our identification, is that we use the strategy method. So people make choices contingent on different states of the world. And I will explain in more detail what this means, but we basically have choices for a borrower, what they would do when they face an income shock, and also choices when they don't face an income shock. And we will look at repayment choices and the use of flexibility, and then also this peer punishment as a measure of social pressure. So let me explain you the setup of the game, which is also the individual liability treatment. So the story is, as I said, it's heavily framed. So it's a microcredit loan that's automatically invested. So we abstract away from this investment decision that's usually studied in ex-ante moral hazard, and we just look at how do people repay. For this, we basically tell the participants that the investment generates a steady income flow, but they also need to repay in each of the periods. So we will have an income of 2R, which in our experiment is symbolized by 2 tokens, and a repayment obligation of 1R. There is no savings, so whatever you don't spend in one period, you cannot use this in the next period. We also have, and this will be important, the shocks that will destroy with a quite high probability of 1/4 the entire income of the period. Given that here in this individual liability treatment, there is no flexibility, basically there's only one choice that the participants are making for each period. Either they repay, and then they have 1 token left, and this token they can consume, and I will talk more about what this means, or they decide not to repay, and that's the ex post moral hazard that we're interested in, and they would just consume their income tokens. So if they repay in all periods, so there's an incentive for repayment, they receive a continuation value down the road, which basically symbolizes the value of the future relationship with the bank. If they don't repay, so in this, there's no distinction between whether you choose not to repay or whether you face an income shock, then the bank considers the borrower as defaulting on the loan, and the borrower will not be able to receive this continuation value. Okay, so maybe a bit more about how it looks like in practice, so you have a better idea. So this is basically how we explained the setup to participants. So you can see here people face the decision to repay and consume, or just default on the loan and consume too, already knowing that in this period they're not facing the shock. And then basically 2 main strategies emerge. The first one is you always repay. You hope you're not facing a shock in one of the future periods, and you will receive the continuation value, which here is 100 peso, basically half a daily wage. Or you choose to default in all 3 periods. You kind of accumulate double the consumption tokens, but you cannot avail the continuation value. So given that this all takes place within rather short time and not over 3 weeks, we kind of induce discounting using a method from experimental economics where the value of the consumption tokens is decreasing over time. So that means that putting everything together, it's calibrated such that it's slightly less beneficial to repay as compared to always consume. So this calibration was necessary because we had quite a lot of repayments, so we needed some baseline defaults that we kind of induced with this difference in monetary benefits of these two different strategies. Okay, now the other three treatments. First one being flexibility. Flexibility, as briefly mentioned before, kind of allows you to defer one repayment obligation to the next period. And in our setting, this is going to be a pass token that can be either used in period 1 or period 2, where the third period is a catch-up period, making all the repayments. And you see here, once you use the pass, the repayment due the next week is doubled. Importantly, we don't have any state verification that would be super costly for the bank to actually go and check for each borrower whether they face an income shock or not. So we actually leave the use of flexibility at the discretion of the borrower. So that means that the pass token can also be used in case the client does not face a shock, kind of creating this trade-off between having a higher consumption now or maybe keeping this pass token for the next period as insurance. Then we have the joint liability treatment, where we simplify the setting to a two-person borrowing group, and people are anonymously matched, but in a session together with their borrowing peers. So they don't know whom exactly they're matching with, but they know that it's someone from their borrower center. And repayment works as follows. We have automatic enforcement of joint liability, which means that if you choose to repay and signal to the bank that you have the capacity to repay, you will also be asked to repay for your partner if the partner does not repay. And here, to keep things simple, we don't make a distinction of why the partner does not repay. So if your partner defaults and does not repay his single installment, or the partner had an income shock, both will lead to you repaying for the partner if you chose to repay. So this means that, and the bank does not really care whether you actually choose to repay or whether your partner chose to repay. The bank just cares about the total repayment. So if the total repayment is equal to 6, then both clients will receive the continuation value. Then, and that's why we have this joint liability treatment, we have social pressure, where people can use costly punishment for the different decisions that the partner is facing. And the calibration is very similar to lab experiments, and importantly, this decision to punish does not influence the repayment capacity. So it comes from a separate budget than the income. And you can see how this looks like for the borrower here in this individual liability treatment. You can choose to allocate up to 2 dislike tokens, so 0, 1, or 2, for the different choices that the partner is facing, including the state of the world where the partner does not face any choice, but faces the income shock. And then we put everything together in joint liability and flexibility, again, having a 2-person borrower group where each of the partners have 1 pass token. And they kind of now face this trade-off between mutual and self-insurance via flexibility facing an income shock. And again, we will elicit this costly punishment conditioning on all the actions that the partner can take in a given period. Now not only focusing on repayment, but also the use of flexibility, either in case of using flexibility to insure against the shock, or using flexibility to increase current consumption. Okay. We had 645 participants in 36 sessions, which lasted about 3 hours. And we have 2 different types of sessions. The one being individual liability sessions, where clients play both individual and individual liability with flexibility treatments. In the joint liability sessions, they play first individual liability, which allows us to compare the choices in the different sessions and make sure that they don't differ, and they don't. And then they also play joint liability and joint liability with flexibility. So this gives rise to a mixture of within and between subject design, where we can compare flexibility, the effect of flexibility within subject, and then we have this cross participants comparison between the liability structure, and additionally we have this comparison between within subject, between individual and joint liability. So importantly, we will always have the same order of these treatments, and you might now wonder whether this kind of influences our results, and we have a bunch of tests that show that it's very unlikely that keeping the order constant, which actually increases a participant's level of understanding, kind of influenced our results. People earned on average a daily wage, and consisting of 3 different components. The first one was just show-up fee, money they received for participating, and that's where we deduct the punishment points from. We also kind of pay out the income tokens, and the income tokens, as they're symbolizing consumption, they're not paid out in cash, but they're actually used to shop at our consumption table that sits in the corner of the session to introduce this temptation of immediate consumption. And then lastly, we have this continuation value, which is paid out 1 month after the experiment by one of the research assistants who go back to the field and redeem the voucher that participants receive at the point of this experiment. Then for the organization of the sessions, we first explain the entire setup. So basically the game that I showed you in individual liability. We then have 3 practice rounds where people kind of familiarize themselves with the shock probability. And then we explain each treatment in detail and also have quizzes to check people's understanding. Importantly, we also exclude participants if they don't meet our understanding threshold, which leaves us with 577 participants. If we include all the participants, it doesn't change the results, but we felt more comfortable using those where we are kind of sure that they actually understand what's going on. Then we use pen and paper, and importantly, the strategy method. As I said, conditional on different stages of the world, we can observe people's decisions.
Lisa, we have a question. Is now a good time to take a question, Lisa?
Can I just finish the slide?
Of course, please do, yeah. Okay.
How did we incentivize all this? So at the end of the decisions of the individual with flexibility treatment or the joint liability with flexibility treatment, we had 1 treatment chosen for payout, and then we actually realized the income shocks and then checked which choices participants made during this, and then we anonymously matched the groups or the partners in the group in the joint liability sessions, and then we calculated the overall payouts. And now it's a good time to take questions.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Question from Rossa at Oxford.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks, Lisa. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify a couple of things in terms of how you match people. So you match people anonymously, but can they then collude in any way? Like, do they have any communication, or is everything anonymous?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that kind of relates as well of how we actually do it. So we match people only at the very end. So you kind of take decisions, you know you're facing a partner, but you don't know who it is. You don't know what decisions the partner are currently making. And then we basically just take the 2 decision sheets where we noted the answers to the participants at the very end. And then we kind of see like what is going on, like what are the dynamics within the game.
Yeah. And so I guess if we try and map this into the real world, that's like a setup where someone can like more explicitly punish their partner, right? But they're not doing anything face to face. So should we be thinking of this as like a social pressure type of thing, or should we be thinking about this as a more explicit punishment mechanism? And so one other part of this question. So just on this slide, it says minus the punishment received and given. So is it also costly to send a punishment as well as to receive one?
Yes, so I wasn't going into much detail, sorry for this. So each punishment point that you're sending is costing you 5 pesos, and the partner that who's receiving it costs 3 times as much, so 15 pesos. And you can allocate punishment points, and then also your partner can allocate punishment points to you. So you might actually have both punishment received and given. Now note that we only realize the punishment at the very end. So there's no feedback in the game, so you cannot actually influence your partner's decision by punishing. So from a game theoretical perspective, it's an incredible threat. You should not be punishing at all. Right, so we think about this as a lower bound in a sense, because in real life you can actually, you will have way more complicated dynamics, and we kind of had to, make sure that it's not getting overly complicated. But the punishment here does not make sense in the sense that you cannot influence your partner's decision.
Sure. So I actually got, thanks, Ross. I actually got 2 more questions. First one, a clarification question from Farah Saeed at Lahore School of Economics, and then I'll go to Julian Lebon.
Hi, thanks. Can you hear me? Okay, so just one simple question on the investment in one period. Does that affect incomes in the next period? So Annette kindly answered part of that question in chat, but I wanted to know if in any case, if it's not affecting income in the next period, how was this clarified to the respondents?
So basically what we used, maybe you can go back. So we abstract away from the investment decision, which means that we kind of only start looking at people's decisions after the investment started, right? And we just tell people, oh, this is your income. You have the steady income of 2, which kind of is what your investment is yielding. So it's stylized in a sense that we cannot elicit all the different decisions that go on in real life, and that's where we are different from field experiments. But this is basically the story that we're telling people. It's and kind of frame it in the microcredit terms.
Got it. So basically there's no spillover between periods, except the fact that if you default in one period, you will not get another loan, for example, right?
Exactly. So also there's only one loan. So this is okay, that's maybe to clarify here. So the loan has been invested, and there's only one loan, and now you're asked to repay it over 3 periods. And importantly, if you default, let's say here, we will still ask you to make a choice in the 3rd period. But this will be conditional on having faced the shock in the previous period to kind of be fair to the participants.
Got it. Thanks.
Thanks, Farah. And Julian Lebon.
Thanks. Just maybe I missed it, but a quick clarifying question. Are those participants from existing microfinance group? Are they completely new? And if they're from groups, are people from the same session, from the same groups? And so you're thinking the kind of like the social pressure you might generate social pressure in those groups because people have existing relationships outside.
Yeah, so yes, people come from, it's not the same group, but it's from the same center. So basically think of a center of a meeting point where people meet each week, and the center consists of 2 to 5 people borrower groups. And I will show you who these participants are now. So we have a predominantly female sample, and like half of them have their own enterprise, about half of them live below the national poverty line, and most of these clients come from a joint liability center. So we do have some variation as well in the liability structure in real life, but I won't have time to go into details today.
Great, thanks. And about 15 or 20 minutes more, if that's okay.
Okay.
Sorry, I do see Annette has her hand up. Annette, did you want to jump in at this point?
Adam, so the centers, the groups also ensure each other within the center. So it is true that there is social capital going on the center level. It's just somewhat weaker than within the groups. So they do have relationships, they do have active social capital.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Okay, then let's look at the results. I will focus on our main questions, which is how does flexibility affect repayment and how does it affect social pressure? Just very briefly for you to know. So people do use flexibility when they face an income shock. Basically, everyone does so. So they do understand this insurance value. But we also see that quite a lot of people use flexibility when they don't face an income shock, and more so in individual liability than joint liability. But now looking at repayment choices, we will look at individual decisions absent a shock. So this is the case where you can repay. We don't match partners to have a fair comparison between the individual and the joint liability treatments, and to kind of abstract away from this additional insurance mechanism that might be going on in joint liability. So only looking at individual decisions here. So this is the share of participants who choose to repay in all 3 periods. And you see the dark bar is a repayment in individual liability, and the gray bar is repayment in joint liability. We do have very high repayment rates, but we don't see any difference in the liability structure. Now, what happens if we introduce flexibility? Repayment drops. So about a fourth, and we don't again see any difference in the liability structure, but this decrease in flexibility is constant. This decrease in repayment with flexibility is constant across the liability structures. How does flexibility affect social pressure? So here again, conditional choices elicited by the strategy method. So for all different types of situation that your partner might be facing in a given period. So first, let's look at the decisions, the punishment decisions in joint liability. Here, looking at the share of punishment you're allocating to your partner, kind of dividing the income tokens by 2 and we see that we do have a fraction of punishment as well when the partner is repaying. So this is going to be hard to rationalize, and I won't have a good explanation for this. But it's also it also features in Christina's experiment in a very different setting in a different country. So there seems to be some baseline level that we will not be able to interpret. And then we see quite a lot of punishment for the case where the partner chooses not to repay. And that's exactly what you would expect, how joint liability works. You're punishing, you're exerting social pressure if the partner is not repaying. However, and this is what we would call the excessive punishment, is this case here where the partner is facing an income shock. It's fully observable to you, and you know it's not the partner's fault, but still we have about like half of the punishment, well, actually more than half of the punishment from the decision not to repay is still applied when the partner is not repaying due to a shock. How does flexibility now influence these decisions? Looking at the case of the shock first, now flexibility gives rise to 2 different strategies. So you can either use flexibility when you're facing an income shock to kind of self-insure instead of relying on the partner to repay. And this decreases this excessive punishment that we've seen here in joint liability by half. But also, if you don't use flexibility to self-insure, you face quite a lot of punishment. So we kind of interpret this as evidence that this flexibility is a preferred way of coping with income shocks. Not only you can use flexibility to like cope with the shock, but you could also just misuse it and kind of use it to increase your consumption. And again, we have two different scenarios here. The first one is you misuse flexibility. So you use flexibility without an income shock, and that's punished less than defaulting. But if you then go on and you default on this double repayment, that's punished the most harshly. But it's not that different from the punishment that you would face when you don't repay a single installment. And particularly kind of flexibility now in this combination of misusing it first and then repaying, not repaying double, gives rise to this cheap default strategy. If you don't want to repay in terms of punishment, it will be cheaper to misuse the flexibility and then also default on this double installment as compared to basically not using flexibility and then go straight for the default options. So to summarize and to put forward our interpretation, so we see that repayment is high independent of the liability structure, and that has also been found in some, not all, field experiment, and we say this might be explained with a social norm on repayment. We do see that flexibility reduces repayment rates by 24%, which we interpret as evidence that the norm is becoming uncertain. For punishment, we do see that there's two features of flexibility. On the one hand, it can reduce this excessive punishment, so it's really beneficial. But on the other hand, we also see that it gives rise to like a cheap way to default on your loan repayments. And again, we see this as punishment reflecting the prevailing social norm, and given that the norm is then less certain with flexibility, the punishment is reduced. So why do we think social norms can explain this? Let me briefly just point out that in our setting, each week the borrower needs to recite a pledge where they kind of promise that they will repay every week, and they will also ensure that other people do the same. So that's all very hand-wavy, so let me continue with providing more rigorous evidence on the social norms. So as I said, we do have a theoretical framework, and we reanalyze our experimental results with respect to these predictions. But I don't think I have time to go into details, because what I really wanted to show you is the elicitation, the measurement of the social norms. So just a very brief intuition of this framework. So the norm kind of prescribes that you need to repay every installment when it's due. And if you don't do so, then you incur a psychological cost. Flexibility, as in our experiment, provides the possibility to defer an installment, so kind of provides discretion in the timing of repayment. And putting these two together means that it's less clear how the norm is applicable when facing flexibility. So we do have predictions. We do see quite a bit of this in the data, but let me jump to the norm elicitation, pointing you towards our working paper, which is up for all the details. So we are measuring social norm using an established method from experimental economics, and we ask participants to rate vignettes where we describe different types of actions with and without flexibility. Given that the norm is basically common understanding what ought to be done, this is not incentivized based on individual decisions, but it's incentivized in the sense of a coordination game where you are asked to match the answers of the other participants. So this has been run with a smaller sample, again with borrowers of our partner microfinance organization in different centers, but in the same regions. And we will answer three main questions. The first one is there actually a social norm for repayment? So do people coordinate on saying whether repayment is desirable or not? Secondly, do social norms for default differ when we introduce flexibility? And how is the punishment that we see in our experiment, which we interpret as a manifestation of the social norm, how is the punishment related to the measured social norms. So let me start with the last point by showing you a table where we order the severeness or the badness of the different decisions according to what people punish in our experiment. And you can see here the mean for the normal elicitation with higher means, meaning it's less appropriate. It nicely lines up in terms of the ranking with the punishment decision. And the same is true if we look at decisions under flexibility. So here, repaying is, of course, the most appropriate thing to do. Defaulting without a shock is the least appropriate thing to do. And the same comes out of the normal elicitation. So yes, punishment can be seen as reflecting social norms, but actually, we didn't really talk about whether there is a social norm. So let me briefly show you results for this one. And for this, I will briefly present you just the descriptives showing which % of respondents opted for a given option. So here we have participants who say, yes, it's very socially appropriate. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have participants who say it's not, or it's totally socially inappropriate to do this given action here. And we see a lot of coordination for repaying without the flexibility. So most people agree that repayment is really the thing to do. So yes, there is a norm for repaying. And we also see, if we look here at how appropriate is it to repay with flexibility, it's substantially reduced. So there's a lot more heterogeneity in the answers. You can also see this in the standard deviations. So it's a lot more dispersed. So it's less clear whether repayment is actually the thing to do. Let me briefly talk about the last point, whether norms for default differ for flexibility and no flexibility. And we will make a distinction between two different cases. The first one is when we use flexibility when we're facing income shocks. The choice, there's actually no choice in flexibility. You just cannot repay. And this is definitely worse than using flexibility to self-insure. We also look at how bad is it to default? So something that we've discussed with the punishment results already. So how bad is it not to repay in 2 consecutive periods? So in no flexibility, this would mean you don't repay and then you don't repay a second time. And in flexibility, we will look at how bad is it to misuse flexibility and then default on the double repayment. And it's less pronounced than in the other example, but still our non-parametric two-sided test shows that these are substantially different. So it's worse, as we also see in the punishment, to just not repay as compared to first misuse the flexibility and then default on a double installment, even though in the end it's basically the same, you just didn't repay twice.
Now we have a question from Julien. You want to take a question now or wait for general discussion?
If possible, can I defer to the general discussion?
Sounds great. So we'll start with Julien when we get to the discussion in just a few minutes' time.
So just to summarize, yes, we do see a social norm for repayment. The social norms do differ for the default cases, and in terms of the ranking, how bad certain actions are, we see that punishment appears to be reflective of the measured social norms. Now I could go into all the details of robustness checks. I guess I can defer this to the general discussion, but maybe the main concerns would be order effects. Just pointing out, maybe for those who are less familiar with the strategy method, it means that there's no feedback between any treatments, any periods. So that in itself should limit learning. And we also have additional measures of rationality to check that this does not increase or decrease over time. Okay, I will briefly conclude. So just to summarize in terms of the results that we have seen, we do see high repayment in both individual and joint liability, and we think that this is consistent with the social norm for repaying each installment when it's due. And then we see a drop in repayment with flexibility, and interpret this with this weakened social norm for repayment. In terms of social pressure, we kind of replicate Christina's finding that there's high excessive punishment. We see quite a bit, both in terms of the intensive as well as the extensive margin of punishing partners who face an income shock that's fully observable. But we see that flexibility can decrease this excessive punishment by half. However, flexibility, and this is again tied to the norm, also decreases the punishment for ex post moral hazard. What would we conclude from here? That norms can actually help explain two recent puzzles in microfinance, the one being why repayment rates do often not differ between individual and joint liability contracts, and then also why peer pressure appears to be excessive. Now, basically making 2 points for this discussion of flexible microcredit, pointing to one benefit, showing that flexibility can help reduce these excessive punishments, but then also this disadvantage, and that's maybe talking more from the point of the lender here, that flexibility can destabilize the high repayment rates that we usually see in microcredit. Now, going forward, what we would conclude from here, that when we introduce any changes in products, not only in microcredit, also in other types of changes that we're making to existing structures, be it in market or institutions, one need to consider the prevailing social norm and might think about how to address this to avoid potential adverse effects. And this was all to say.
Great.
I kind of display here as well the official pledge that the borrowers recite each week, just to make this point that the lender really tries very hard to instill this norm of being a good borrower. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lisa. So we've got 10 minutes and at least 3 questions. Julian, you still have a question, I think?
Yeah, so just quickly, I think, it's really fascinating, and I can imagine how much trouble you went through to explain those things, having done fieldwork in the Philippines. That must have been really quite complicated. But I have a question regarding, so you basically say that introducing flexibility is kind of potentially weaken social norm, right? That's basically it. But in a sense, what I'm just wondering whether it weakens the social norm, it kind of makes it unclear in the short run what the social norm is, and whether if people were playing those microfinance games for 6 months, you would kind of go back to the equilibrium you had before, but people would be happier because they would have a bit more flexibility. And so I just wonder if you can tell us anything about, one, whether there was any flexibility in the contract they were facing before, or they were only used to the kind of the standard contract. And if you see that, like, as people play the game multiple times, do you see differences in like kind of early rounds and later rounds? And I don't know if there's anything you can try to distinguish in that sense, because yeah, it's just kind of, maybe there's a way for the microfinance group to, in the short run, kind of help people converge to the norm they like, in a sense. Or do you think it's not going to happen?
Yeah, so that's actually a very good remark, I say. So it is true that for our participants, they all come from this very rigid norm, of this very rigid repayment, where they have this norm that's focusing on repaying each installment. Right? So it's a very particular norm, and it kind of interacts with our particular type of repayment flexibility. And we only see what happens if we introduce this flexibility to someone who has not seen it before. And this is true both in the experiment and the norm elicitation. So it is not, so we are not able to say anything about how would the norm develop. Will the lender be able to address this, and how it will play out in the long run, depending on how participants are also using the social pressure to kind of maybe go back to this equilibrium depending on what the long run dynamics are.
Thank you. Annette, did you want to jump in briefly on that? No, you're muted, sorry.
Yeah, hi. So we discussed this quite extensively in the conclusion, and while we're clearly only playing this once, and we don't know what would happen if we replay this repeatedly, it's theoretically possible that the norm would adapt to the use of flexibility, but there are several good reasons to think that this is not at all trivial. The first being that a norm for flexibility use would likely have to distinguish between flexibility use for shocks and flexibility use without shocks. And in practice, these are never perfectly observable. So it's not actually clear what that norm would look like. So that's the first point. You need observability of shocks. And the second point is what can be implemented in practice in terms of a norm. So we hypothesize that it's the lender who's instilling these norms with the pledge with other measures building social capital, like the pledge that Lisa put on the last slide. And it's very easy to say you have to pay every week or every month. If you're trying to instill in a pledge, well, you should be repaying, but if there's a shock, you don't have to, but then you have to repay twice the following week. So in practice, it's not trivial at all how you would enforce that and how you would induce that practically.
Great. Thanks very much, Annette. Let's go to Sangamitra Mukherjee at Oxford.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Lisa, for a super interesting presentation. I had a question around the results you show for punishment. So you see that sometimes participants choose to punish their partner even when they repay, or sometimes when they don't repay but they had an observable shock. It's possible, I guess, that sometimes this behavior is driven by their actual experiences with like group borrowing at the microfinance institution. So is there any way you can actually link the data from the lab and field experiment to the actual borrowing default repayment data, like for that participant with the microfinance institution?
Yeah, so what we can do is we can link it to the liability structure that clients face in real life. And we do see more pronounced patterns for joint liability clients. So it seems that they know better what to do. So you see here, there is more confusion in the individual liability clients with respect to when you actually should be punishing the partner, as compared to joint liability clients who punish less and punish way more when the participant does not repay even they could. We don't really know why we see this high excessive joint liability, this excessive pressure here in the joint liability for clients who come from joint liability in real life. But so that's a kind of evidence that we can provide from real life that clients who come from this norm that that might actually entail building up social pressure within the group do behave somewhat differently than individual liability clients. However, as a side note, so we only have very few individual liability clients, so we won't be able to do much in terms of the heterogeneity.
Thank you, Lisa. And let's go for one last brief question to Mohammed Mekki, and then we'll wrap things up.
Thanks for a very interesting presentation, very careful experiment. I was just thinking about the social norms and whether other members of a joint liability group feel it's appropriate to punish or etc. In your experiment, you essentially forced everyone to take an investment, right? You forced everyone to invest. And we know, I guess, in microfinance, many people don't use their loans for investment. So maybe it's worth, you may be doing this in the paper just to get a sense of whether that's important in terms of us extrapolating to outside the field. You forced everyone to invest, and someone may decide to not repay their loans because they didn't have the option of not investing, right? You've exposed them to some kind of like stochastic kind of environment, which they may not have chosen to do. They may have chosen just to leave it in cash. So I'll probably just leave it as a comment. Maybe we can chat about it later.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. So yes, it's true. We impose a lot of structure in this. We also kind of force people into these joint liability groups where they cannot fully observe what their partner is doing, which is also kind of different from real life. And that might also explain this punishment for people who do repay, because people are maybe just upset with being in the situation that we put them into. But we will not be able really to address this in a more rigorous way.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me just check if I don't even know if I'm on mute.
No, we can hear you.
No, thank you. Sorry. I was just going to say thank you very much to Mohammed for that question. And thanks, Lisa, for a fascinating talk. Please, as everyone, stay tuned to the Twitter feed. Next week, we've got James Fensky, who will be presenting on the Colombian exchange and conflict in Asia, probably at 4 p.m., but we'll announce the time, as always, on Twitter in advance. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again, Lisa.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.